Today, I'm going to talk about a narrow tactical element in Marengo. If you're interested, I've already done a video giving a broader overview of the game. But I find that when you're trying to analyse a game, what you need to do is start with small tactical elements and then build up to a bigger picture. And here, I'm going to start with this position at the beginning of the Austrian turn at 8 o'clock. That is the third Austrian turn of the game. This is a perfectly normal position you can create in the opening. In fact, it is a position or very close to a position that I had on Monday night when I last played the game. And it raises a question. The Austrians have 2 units on the approach in the North Road locale. If units are on the approach, they can conduct an assault. You cannot assault from the reserve, only ever from an approach, which usually means you have to spend an hour moving up to the approach in order to launch an assault. Think of it as deploying out from march into battle lines. And the obvious question is, can those 2 Austrian units force that approach and take the locale? And the answer is no, but sort of. Let's quickly revisit, slightly simplified, the assault procedure. A player has to spend an order to conduct an assault, which means a maximum of 3 assaults a turn. You can't probe everywhere on a line, only make 3 attacks in a turn. You can only do that if you're willing to give up the use of the commands for something else. Once the attacker's declared it, the defender reveals a leading unit. Just one on a narrow approach. We're not going to worry about wide approaches at the moment. So the attacker knows what the strength of the defending unit is before they make their own decisions. And that is really important. And it's one of the things you need to internalise. So the attacker now chooses their leading unit. If the defender had more than one unit in there, so a unit in addition to the leading unit, they have various options for counterattacks, but that doesn't apply here. We're going to look at it in a bit, but we don't need to worry about it now. Finally, we compare the strengths of the units. To win, the attacker has to have more strength points than the defender. Remember that every approach in the game gives a -1 to infantry attacks, and some approaches give additional penalties either to cavalry, and there is one approach that gives an additional -1, so there's a total of -2 on infantry attacks. But every approach gives infantry at least a -1. Things get pretty simple when we are dealing with typical narrow approaches and only a single defending unit. For our purposes, we don't need to know what the defending unit is, just what strength it represents. So 1, 2 or 3. And there are only 3 possible types of leading units an attacker can declare. So we get a results table that looks like this. Most matchups result in the assault failing. I've marked them with a black X. Both the attacking unit and the defending unit lose 1 point of strength. The attacker also loses 1 point of morale because they lost 1 strength point. And the defender has to commit a point of morale because they successfully defended the approach. That's not going to matter in this specific example because the French can take a point of committed morale away at the end of each turn. In wide approaches and when there's counterattacks involved, it also increases the amount of morale that's committed. That's not going to matter too much in this example. If the defender has only 1 strength point, then an unimpeded cavalry or a 3 strength infantry will break through the defence and take the locale. Which means tactically, if you're planning to assault somewhere, you should have some of those units in the mix. Note that a 2-point infantry will always fail if a defence of any sort is mounted. Finally, if the defender has a 3 strength infantry and you commit only a 2 strength infantry against it, it will be beaten by 2 points. That is, it's a 2-point infantry, it will be reduced to a 1-point infantry because it's attacking across an approach that has a penalty, because all approaches have penalties, which means that the defending unit will be 2 points stronger against a 2-point unit. And in that situation, you take an additional loss. And thus, 2 morale lost for the army. Again, another reason to have some cavalry or 3-point infantry in any assault mix. And importantly, remember that thing, you get to see what the defender has declared before you make your decision. So most of the time, you want to throw 2-point infantries at these sorts of problems to wear down the defenders, but occasionally you need a cavalry or 3-strength infantry to either avoid a double morale loss or to achieve a breakthrough. Anyway, let's assume in the example we are looking at that the Austrians launched an assault, that the defending unit is a 2-point infantry, and that the Austrians committed a 2-point infantry of their own. The result, both units are now reduced to 1-point infantries. They both take a loss, which means obviously the Austrians have not taken the position. But it's a little more complicated than just this one assault. If the second unit is a cavalry, and it would have to be to have created this position at 8 o'clock, then it could attack the next turn at 9 o'clock, and because it's a 2-point cavalry against a 1-point defender, it would succeed and break through. This would be a good result for the Austrians, as the French would lose at least 1 morale for losing the unit, so that would be an equal trade for the 1 morale they lost at 8 o'clock. And it's worth noting that in the position we're looking at here, there would be nothing the French could do about it. The nearest unit is 2 moves away from reinforcing the position, and it needs to be a cavalry just to do that, because it needs to continue into the approach when it moves in, and infantry would be 3 turns away. Which I think is a useful point to understand. To successfully defend this northern approach at that junction, the defending unit either has to be better than 2 points, or there has to be a cavalry in a position that can be sent to reinforce it. And the French have to make that decision at 7 o'clock, before the assault actually happens. Okay, let's momentarily consider 2 other possibilities in this position. The first is that the defending piece is actually a 3-point infantry. The second is that the French player did move a cavalry at 7 o'clock so that it can support the position. What happens in these 2 scenarios? Note the distribution of the Austrian forces. I think it's a reasonable mixture of troops for the Austrians to be commit in this scenario. There are limits to what you can get into this position at 8 o'clock. Scenario 1, 3-point infantry. The Austrians attack at 8 o'clock, and they need to commit their cavalry to avoid a double morale loss. Then, at 9 o'clock, they attack again, this time using the 2-point infantry, while they bring the 3-point infantry into position for the final assault. But the 3-point infantry will succeed. The end result of the fighting will be that both sides lose 3 strength points, the Austrians lose 2 morale, and the French lose 1. Let's look at scenario 2. This can play out the same way. Basically, the French declare the units as defending units 1 at a time. But it doesn't need to, there's an alternative. The first Austrian assault at 8 o'clock will be beaten back by the French infantry. Then the French cavalry will arrive. The Austrian player knows that the arriving piece is a cavalry and that it's strength 2, because the French player has to reveal it when they make the continuation to move it into the approach. Now, when the Austrians assault, there are a couple of options. If the Austrians had a 2-point infantry, which in this case they don't, it could be stopped by the 1-point infantry being declared as a leading unit. Yes, the 1-point infantry would blow up, but it would still have stopped the attack. That would leave an entirely fresh cavalry to fend off another attack at 10 o'clock. So it makes sense for the French to declare their 1-point infantry as the leading unit. Remember, they have to do that before the Austrians decide which unit they will commit themselves as the attacker. Well, a 1-point unit, as we saw with the table earlier, can be beaten by either a 3-point infantry or a 2-point cavalry. But here is where counterattacks matter. If the cavalry counterattacks, it is immediately reduced by 1 strength, but it is then added to the defence. And because it is a cavalry, the attacker takes an additional strength point loss, and thus an additional morale loss. The surviving point of cavalry can then pull back to the reserve and retreat from the Austrian attack. Both sides have lost 3 strength, but the Austrians have lost 3 morale and the French none. Technically, the French would probably end up losing 1 morale here because of the counter-attack. They'd have to commit a bit more morale, and they probably wouldn't have time to remove it. But the general point stands, and I hope that what you're seeing in these examples is that the relative loss of strength between the two sides isn't changing, but the relative loss of morale is. As the defence gets stronger, the attacker is proportionally losing more morale. And we can work up a rough rule of thumb here. Assaults tend, if properly conducted by both sides, and there are lots of ways you can screw them up, to be fairly even. Both sides tend to lose about the same amount of strength. For every point of defender strength, the attacker will need to expend a point of their own strength, and they will usually need to spend an hour making assaults. 2 points of strength, 2 hours. 3 points of strength, 3 hours. 4 points, 4 hours, and so on. 2 armies will, between them, suffer a morale loss, again roughly equal to the total strength of the defenders. But unlike the strength of the units, that's not evenly distributed. The defender generally only loses 1 point on the final assault when their troops break. All of the rest will be levied against the attacker. As we've just been through, the stronger the defence, the more lopsided the morale loss has become. And understanding that begins to turn this from just a simple explanation of how this element of the game works to a tactical and strategic consideration. The more defensive strength points are in a narrow approach, the more uneven the morale losses will be, and therefore the less favourable that assault will be to the attacker, and the more favourable it will be to the defender, which is generally going to be the French. Attack can take 3 different positions with 2-point infantries, and you'll lose 3 morale and inflict 3. Attack a single position with 6 strength points, and you will lose 5 for only inflicting 1. The Austrian player needs to find weak positions that cannot be easily reinforced and batter through those in order to turn the French line. The French player wants to sustain battles once they are joined, to bleed out the Austrian army. I think this also gives us a bit of useful opening theory. There is a fairly obvious opening strategy. Try to push along the North Road, turning the French position and threatening the objective by taking the village in the north, which I can't pronounce. The French player wanting to block that is precisely why we would end up with positions like the one we started with. The problem is that at 11 o'clock the French get a group of reinforcements, so there's a race going on. Move too slowly and you end up having to bludgeon your way through the town as well. That's been my experience of several games. You certainly don't have time to bring up artillery if the French block the northern road. It wouldn't be firing until 10 o'clock, and if the French unit was reinforced or a 3-point unit, you wouldn't be able to force it until 11 o'clock at the earliest. However, if you hit it early with a mixture of forces, including some cavalry and 3-strength infantry, as well as bog-standard 2-point infantry, starting at 8 o'clock, you can probably force the approach by 10, even against a relatively strong defender. And that is a possibility the French player needs to consider. If they don't have a 3-point infantry in the north, or cavalry in the right place to reinforce, blocking the northern road won't be more than a speed bump to a determined Austrian attack. I had been taking the blocking manoeuvre by the French as a must, but I'm now thinking about alternatives. Anyway, as I said before, I'll only continue to do this if I continue to get opportunities to play, but if I do, I think it would be interesting in the next one to talk about how dramatically combat changes once you get into the open eastern half of the board. Though the rules for assaults are the same, other than wide approaches allowing 2 units to lead, they make a huge difference. It's much less calculable, much swingier than it was here. For now, here endeth the lesson.